The violet sky bled crimson with the setting of Talax Prime's twin suns, but Brian Thomas barely noticed. His makeshift clinic, usually a place of quiet desperation, had become a cacophony of terrified chirps and raspy coughs. The alien children of the Talaxian colony were dying, and he was running out of time. Only he, it seemed, had any chance of helping them. A small Talaxian girl, no older than 5 cycles, wheezed on the examination table, her skin a disturbing shade of pale lavender mottled with angry red rashes. Brian pressed a cold, metallic stethoscope against her chest, the alien alloy sending a shiver down his spine despite the sweltering heat of the Talaxian day. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, each inhale a desperate struggle. The disease was progressing at an alarming rate. Cross-species medicine, he thought, his brow furrowing. The galaxy's most useless specialty until today. His expertise, honed over years of thankless research, was all that stood between these children and oblivion. But the alien biology was a minefield. Human treatments were often ineffective, sometimes even lethal. He ran a diagnostic scan, the archaic device sputtering and whirring, displaying a cascade of indecipherable alien symbols. A cold dread washed over him. He remembered the last time he'd faced a disease like this. The vibrant green fields of Ethel turned to ash, the laughter silenced, the colony gone. He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of lifeless bodies burned into his memory. Not again, he pleaded silently. He rummaged through a crate overflowing with mismatched medical supplies, half of which were expired or incompatible with Talaxian physiology. A tattered bandage here, a half-empty vial of antibiotics there. The colony's isolation was a death sentence in slow motion. He straightened, his back cracking in protest, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Zara, a Talaxian elder with eyes as deep and gray as a storm cloud, watched him from across the room. Her face was etched with worry, her antennae twitching nervously. She approached him, her gait slow but steady, her presence radiating a quiet strength. "Dr. Thomas," she rasped, her voice thick with concern. "The children, they grow weaker with each passing sun cycle. How much longer must they suffer?" Brian sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Zara, you know I'm doing everything I can, but this disease, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. My equipment is primitive, my knowledge limited. I need more time, more resources." As if to punctuate his words, the monitor beside the little girl on the table flatlined. A high-pitched whine filled the clinic, cutting through the other noises. Brian closed his eyes, a wave of nausea washing over him. Another one gone. Zara placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "We have heard promises before, Doctor. Humans came to Talax Prime, boasting of cures and progress. They left only empty words and broken hearts." She paused, her gaze piercing. "But I see something different in you. A grit, a willingness to fight." Brian swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked at the lifeless child, then back at Zara. "This isn't natural," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The genetic markers, they're all wrong. It's like someone deliberately engineered this disease." He turned back to Zara, his eyes burning with intensity. "Tell me, Zara, do you know of any old stories, legends, anything about a disease that ravaged Talax Prime long ago?" Zara hesitated, her expression clouding over. "Why do you ask, human? Those are ancient secrets not meant for outsiders." Suddenly, a group of Talaxians burst into the clinic, their faces contorted with anger. At their head stood a tall, gaunt figure with burning eyes and a voice that dripped with venom. "Thomas," he shouted, his words tinged with accusation, "you are poisoning our children. Your so-called medicine is making them worse." Brian stood his ground, his eyebrows furrowed. "I'm trying to help them. I'm doing everything I can." "Lies," the zealot spat. "You are a plague upon our world. Leave now before we force you to." Brian glared at the crowd, his voice ringing with defiance. "I'm not going anywhere. These children need me and I won't abandon them." A tense silence descended upon the clinic, broken only by the ragged breathing of the sick. The standoff had begun. The air crackled with unspoken threats. The Talaxians, their chitinous faces tight with suspicion, parted only slightly as Zara stepped forward, her voice resonating with an authority that seemed to momentarily quell their fear. "Enough," she commanded, her three eyes fixed on the crowd. "These are our children, they suffer. If there is even a sliver of hope in this human, we must seize it. Would you condemn them to death out of fear?" Her words, sharp as shards of glass, seemed to pierce through the collective anxiety. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a hesitant acknowledgement. Brian, feeling the weight of their gaze, remained still. He was granted a temporary reprieve. He turned toward the small, lifeless form lying on a bio pallet, its skin a ghastly shade of lavender. Reaching for his battered medical kit, he retrieved a sterile swab and gently collected samples from the child's mottled skin. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of alien sickness and the faint, earthy aroma of Zara's calming incense. Back at his makeshift lab, a corner of the clinic illuminated by the harsh glare of a salvaged diagnostic lamp, Brian hunched over his antiquated microscope. The magnified cells swam into focus, revealing an intricate, almost beautiful structure, but within that beauty lay death. He muttered to himself, "Damn that protein structure. I've never seen anything like it." He straightened, turning to Zara, who watched him with cautious curiosity. "Zara, I need your help. This disease, it's unlike anything I've encountered. I need you to translate any ancient Talaxian medical texts you have. Anything about unusual proteins or bioscourges." Zara hesitated, her antennae twitching nervously. "The texts are sacred, and the colony, they would not approve of me sharing them with a human." Her voice was barely a whisper. "But the children," she relented, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I will help, but this must remain secret. If the others knew I was collaborating with you." She trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. That night, cloaked in shadows, Zara led Brian to a hidden chamber beneath the clinic. Dust motes danced in the beam of Brian's lamp as Zara carefully unfurled brittle scrolls, their surfaces covered in intricate glyphs. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and forgotten rituals. "This speaks of a bioscourge," Zara said, her voice hushed with reverence and dread. "Used in the Great Civil War generations ago, it nearly destroyed Talax Prime. It twisted flesh, shattered minds, left entire cities barren." She pointed to a glyph depicting a spiral-shaped organism. "The texts say it targeted specific genetic markers. It was selective." Brian felt a chill crawl down his spine. His mind flashed back to a sterile lab, to complex equations and whispered ethical debates. "Selective," he repeated, his voice barely audible. He had to tell her. "Zara, there's something you need to know. Before I came here, I worked on similar projects. Bioweapons research. It was controversial, shut down after an accident." Zara recoiled as if struck. Her eyes widened and her antennae flattened against her head. You created weapons of death." The accusation hung in the air, thick with betrayal. Brian met her gaze, his own filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. "I believed I was helping to defend humanity. But I was wrong. I saw the consequences. That's why I became a doctor. That's why I'm here. I swear, Zara, I want to help these children." Her expression softened, but suspicion still lingered. "I do not understand your kind, Brian Thomas, but I see. You are trying, but tell me, can you stop this?" As if in answer, a fresh wave of panicked cries erupted from the main clinic. The disease was accelerating. Children were collapsing, their breathing ragged, their skin blistering with grotesque lesions. Resources were dwindling. Brian stared at the empty vials, his expression resolute. He needed an incubator, and fast. Scavenging through piles of discarded machinery, he found a broken atmospheric regulator, some heat coils, and a discarded nutrient tank. Working feverishly, he began piecing them together, his fingers flying across the salvaged components. Hours later, bathed in sweat and grease, He stood back to admire his handiwork, a jury-rigged incubator powered by a sputtering generator but functional. Zara watched him, her 3 eyes filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. You built this from scraps." Brian wiped his brow, a weary smile tugging at his lips. "Necessity is the mother of invention, Zara, a human saying." He glanced at the incubator, his hope flickering. Zara, seemingly swayed by Brian's tireless dedication, led him back to the hidden chamber. She approached one of the ancient scrolls and pressed on a seemingly innocuous marking. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small vial filled with a viscous, luminescent fluid. "My ancestors," she explained, her voice trembling slightly, "passed this down through generations. A potent antiviral concoction, its effectiveness against this bioscourge is unknown, but it is all we have left." Brian carefully took the vial, holding it up to the light. The fluid shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Back in his lab, he ran a series of tests, his brow furrowed in concentration. The readings were promising. The concoction contained complex organic compounds that seemed to bind to the unusual protein structure he had identified earlier. A glimmer of hope sparked within him. But the zealous faction, fueled by fear and suspicion, was gaining ground. Whispers spread through the colony like a poison, twisting Brian's actions into acts of malice. "He is poisoning our children," they hissed. "He is an agent of the old enemy." Brian and Zara knew they were running out of time. They had to act. "We need to test this," Brian said, his voice grim. "On a small group of terminally ill children. It's a risk, but it's our only chance." Days blurred into nights as Brian and Zara monitored the children. Then, a miracle. One of the children, a small girl named Lyra, showed a slight improvement. Her breathing eased, her fever subsided, her skin regained a touch of its natural hue. But their fragile hope was shattered when Brian intercepted a coded message transmitted on a restricted Talaxian frequency. The message spoke of sabotaging the clinic's power supply, plunging the incubator into darkness and rendering the remaining medicine useless. Brian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about distrust. This was deliberate. "They're trying to kill them, Zara. They're actively working to spread the disease." Zara's expression hardened. "It is the circle of purity. They believe only pure-blooded Talaxians are worthy of survival. They have always sought to cleanse the colonies of those they deem impure." Her touch. The lights flickered violently, plunging the clinic into near darkness. The incubators sputtered, their rhythmic hum faltering. "No, no, no," Brian yelled, scrambling towards the emergency generator. Zara, despite her weakened state, was already there, her multi-jointed fingers deftly manipulating the power conduits. Sparks flew as they worked in tandem, Brian barking instructions, Zara responding with terse Talaxian phrases. Finally, with a groan of overworked machinery, the generator roared back to life. The lights stabilized and the incubators resumed their life-sustaining rhythm. They had managed to get the incubator back online just in time, but the victory was short-lived. The child who had shown initial improvement, the one Brian had dared to hope for, suddenly convulsed. A new rash, this one a sickly, pulsating green, erupted across its delicate skin. Its breathing became shallow and rapid, a desperate rasp that cut through the clinic's anxious silence. These were not the symptoms of the original infection. These new, alarming symptoms differed from the others, implying resistance to the antiviral. Brian, his face grim, leaned over the child, his handheld scanner whirring as it analyzed the new biosignatures. "Damn it," he muttered, the scanner's display flashing a string of complex alien characters. He ran another diagnostic, then another, his frustration growing with each negative result. He needed better equipment, a proper lab, but all he had was this glorified shed. He looked up at Zara, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "The disease. It has mutated," he announced, his voice heavy with dread. He confirmed the disease had mutated further, making the original antiviral formula less effective. Zara's antennae drooped, her usually vibrant blue skin paling. The ancient texts, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There were warnings of bioweapons that could adapt, evolve. The mutation could have been predicted based on deeper understanding of Talaxian bioweaponry. She pressed the tips of her fingers to her temples, trying to force the memories to surface. I should have remembered more. I have remembered more from the ancient texts. A wave of guilt washed over her, her shoulders slumping. I have failed them, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Zara felt immense guilt, fearing her limited knowledge was condemning the children. Brian placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. Zara, no, this isn't your fault. You've given us more than anyone could have expected. He looked at the readings on his scanner, his mind already racing, trying to find a solution. It's my turn now. It's my human capacity for rapid analysis and adaptation that matters now. He turned back to the makeshift lab, his movements purposeful. He grabbed beakers, pipettes, and the few remaining vials of the antiviral, his mind a whirlwind of chemical equations and genetic sequences. He began to experiment with modifying the antiviral formula to combat the new mutation, using the clinic's limited resources. News of the child's relapse spread like wildfire through the colony. Whispers turned into shouts, fear into anger. The zealous faction, sensing an opportunity, seized upon the situation. They exploited the child's relapse to further incite the Talaxians, claiming Brian's cure is a hoax that harms purebloods. He's poisoning our children. A voice boomed, amplified by a makeshift speaker. He's not a healer, he's a destroyer. Zara and Brian, unable to convince the colony that they had not intentionally harmed the child, were forced to work in secret, facing growing suspicion and hostility. The glares, the muttered insults, the slammed doors, they were constant reminders of their isolation. Hours blurred into a frantic cycle of experimentation and analysis. Brian, fueled by caffeine and desperation, pored over the disease's genetic code, searching for a weakness, a vulnerability. He noticed something strange, a recurring pattern that didn't belong. Brian discovers a pattern in the disease's genetic code indicating its creation involved splicing genes from multiple Talaxian species. He called Zara over, pointing to the anomaly on the scanner's display. Look at this. This isn't natural, these sequences. They're from different Talaxian species. Zara's eyes widened. That's impossible. No natural disease could do that. Zara identifies the species used in splicing as one that produces specialized digestive enzymes that are also psychoactive in large doses. The xylose beetle. Its digestive enzymes are incredibly potent and highly psychoactive in large doses. Brian's mind raced. Psychoactive. That could explain the increased resistance. The disease is using the beetle's enzymes to shield itself. Brain thinks these psychoactive components could be creating the increased disease resistance and tries using different enzymes to destabilize their current state. He grabbed a vial of a synthesized enzyme inhibitor, a long shot, but it was all he had. He ran another simulation, the results flashing across the screen. It might work, but it needs a catalyst. A rare element only found in the Talaxian mountains. Brian realizes the modified formula requires a rare element only found in the Talaxian mountains, which is extremely difficult to access without the colony's resources. The air in the clinic grew thick with tension. They were running out of time, running out of options. Brian and Zara, facing a moral dilemma, must choose which children receive the remaining original antiviral, knowing it may only delay the inevitable. As Brian carefully rationed the remaining doses, a chilling realization dawned on him. There was a pattern, a connection between those most severely affected. He cross-referenced their genetic profiles. his fingers flying across the scanner's interface. Brian, while rationing, finds a pattern among the children affected most by the disease. They all have genetic markers linked to a specific trade agreement. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the zealous faction was closing in. They knew Zara held the key to understanding the disease, the key to creating a more potent weapon. The zealous faction sets a trap for Zara, attempting to capture her and silence her knowledge of the ancient texts. As Zara walked back from gathering herbs, 3 figures emerged from the alleyway, their faces hidden behind dark cloaks. They lunged, grabbing her arms, trying to drag her away. Brian, sensing something was wrong, raced after her. He burst into the alley, tackling one of the figures, sending him sprawling. The other 2 turned on him, their faces contorted with hatred. A brutal fight ensued, Brian's human strength pitted against their Talaxian agility. He managed to fend them off, rescuing Zara from the zealous faction, narrowly escaping with vital clues about the faction's leader. A small, intricately carved symbol dropped by one of the attackers. Back in the clinic, Brian examined the symbol under a magnifying glass. It was the insignia of the Talaxian Council. He recognized the faction leader as a high-ranking member of the Talaxian Council, who stands to benefit politically from the colony's unrest. The pieces fell into place. The disease, the sabotage, the propaganda. It was all orchestrated. Brian now understands that the disease isn't just about eliminating undesirables. It's a power play orchestrated by the faction to seize control. His eyes narrowed, his face hardened. He would not let them win. He dedication to expose the faction's conspiracy to what colonists remain and their plan to continue to attack. Brian winced, pressing a grimy cloth to the gash on Zara's arm. The firefight had been close, too close. "We need to find somewhere secure," he muttered, scanning the desolate landscape. The last of the suns dipped below the horizon, plunging the area into an eerie twilight. Zara, her face etched with pain, pointed towards a cluster of crumbling structures in the distance. "An old research outpost, abandoned decades ago. It's our best chance." They moved cautiously, the silence broken only by their ragged breaths and the crunch of their boots on the loose gravel. The outpost was a skeletal husk of its former self, riddled with rust and decay. Inside, flickering emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows. "Secure enough," Brian said, more to himself than Zara. He located a power terminal and, with a few deft manipulations of wires and scavenged components, managed to bring a section of the lab back online. Later, hunched over a cracked monitor, Brian scrubbed through the security footage from the ambush. He paused, zooming in on the faction leader's weapon. "There," he said, pointing to a faint energy discharge. "A unique signature. I've seen something like this before." Zara studied the image, her brow furrowed. "That symbol, it's a variation of a forbidden glyph. It represents amplified emotion." Amplified emotion, Brian echoed, puzzled. Centuries ago, some of our ancestors sought to weaponize emotions, to use fear and hatred as a weapon. The practice was outlawed, the technology supposedly destroyed. Zara's voice was grim. This is a perversion of our history." The following hours were a blur of frantic activity. Brian, using salvaged equipment, managed to isolate and identify the energy signature. Zara, meanwhile, explained that the faction leader was using the weapon to amplify negative emotions within the colony, sowing discord and paranoia. It explained the increased zealotry, the growing distrust. "He's not just trying to control us," Zara said, her voice tinged with anger. "He's trying to break us." Brian managed to synthesize a small batch of the modified antiviral, but the yield was tragically low, enough for perhaps a handful of doses. He administered it to the sickest children, his hands trembling. Some showed signs of improvement, their breathing easing, their fever subsiding. Others remained unchanged, their tiny bodies racked with coughs, their eyes vacant. The mutation was proving unpredictable. Despair threatened to engulf him, but Zara's presence was a grounding force. "There is another way," she said, her voice firm. "A legend of a hidden valley in the Talaxian Mountains, a place where a rare element can be found, an element that can counteract this. Emotional poison. What's the catch?" Brian asked, already knowing there would be one. "The valley is guarded," Zara said, her eyes troubled, "by creatures sensitive to amplified negative emotions." Brian considered this. "I might have something that can help, a sonic dampener. Modified, it could mask our own emotions, at least temporarily." He began tinkering with a device he had salvaged from a crashed freighter. As they prepared to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a Talaxian medic, their face pale with fear. They pressed a crumpled map into Brian's hand. "Take this. It shows safe passages through the colony and the patrol routes of the faction." The medic glanced around nervously. "Be careful, they suspect you." Their journey to the mountains was fraught with peril. They moved through the desolate landscape, avoiding settlements and sticking to the shadows. But they weren't careful enough. A patrol of the zealous faction ambushed them in a narrow canyon. A brief, brutal firefight ensued. Brian, armed with a scavenged pulse rifle, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Zara, despite her injury, was a formidable opponent, her movements swift and deadly. They managed to escape, but not without cost. Their limited supply of ammunition was further depleted. The faction leader, observing their escape from a hidden command center, snarled. "They think they can hide. Release the hunters. Find them. Kill them." Brian and Zara reached the foothills of the Talaxian Mountains. The air grew colder, the landscape more rugged. They approached the entrance to the hidden valley, and what they found there chilled them to the bone. The valley was surrounded by mutated Talaxian wildlife, grotesque, twisted creatures with glowing eyes and snarling maws. They were agitated, restless, their bodies trembling with almost unchecked rage. "The amplified emotions," Brian whispered, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It's driving them mad." He activated the sonic dampener. A low hum filled the air. The creatures seemed to pause, momentarily confused, but their confusion was short-lived. They began to adapt, their senses adjusting to the dampened emotional field. "It's not enough," Zara said, her voice urgent. "We need to rely on stealth and my knowledge of the local flora. Some of these plants can mask our scent." They moved cautiously, weaving through the mutated wildlife, relying on Zara's expertise to avoid detection. The valley was a labyrinth of towering rock formations and dense vegetation. Deep inside they found it, the rare element. It pulsed with a faint, ethereal light, guarded by a massive, ancient Talaxian golem. The golem was a construct of stone and metal, its energy source directly linked to the planet's core. It slumbered, but its presence was palpable, a silent sentinel watching over its charge. The ground trembled. The golem stirred. It was awakening. "The hunters," Zara hissed. "They're here, their amplified emotions. It's waking it." Brian understood. The golem wasn't inherently hostile. It was reacting to the emotional disturbances, a defense mechanism triggered by the faction's weapon. "We need to stop them," Zara said, raising her pulse rifle. "No," Brian said, lowering her weapon. "Not yet." He took a deep breath. "I have an idea, a crazy one." "Brian, no, it's too dangerous," Zara protested. Brian ignored her. He activated a small device on his wrist, a device he had been working on in secret. "This is a universal empathy language I developed. It translates emotions into feelings that any sentient being can understand." He stepped forward towards the golem. "I'm going to try to communicate with it." Zara watched him, her face a mask of fear and disbelief. "You're insane," she whispered. Brian focused his mind, projecting his memories of compassion, of healing, of the countless lives he had saved. He opened himself up to the golem, offering his empathy, his intentions. The golem paused, its stone eyes focusing on Brian. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint tremor ran through its body. It understood. It saw the purity of Brian's intentions. With a groan of stone and metal, the golem weakened the security field around the rare element. "Take what you need," a voice echoed in Brian's mind, a voice that was ancient and powerful. "But be warned, a greater threat approaches." As they gathered the element and turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the faction leader, his eyes burning with hatred. "So the human thinks he can play hero," he sneered, raising his weapon. "You're too late. I've already perfected the device. Soon, I will weaponize the amplified negative emotions to conquer not just this colony but the entire star system." He gestured, revealing a larger, more menacing version of the weapon, a prototype, humming with dark energy. Zara crumpled. Her hands flew to her temples, fingers digging into the violet skin as if to claw out the pain. The emotion amplifier, held aloft by the faction leader, pulsed with a sickly green light. Then it turned toward Brian. A wave of nausea slammed into him, not physical, but something far more insidious. Images flashed behind his eyes. A sterile lab, a dying patient, his own trembling hands, the echoing pronouncement of failure. The faces of the Talaxian children blurred with the memory of another's last breath. Doubt, a corrosive acid, ate at his tenacity. He stumbled, the weight of past mistakes threatening to crush him. Yet even as the darkness closed in, a flicker of scientific curiosity ignited. He focused, forcing himself to analyze the onslaught. There, beneath the waves of despair, was a pattern, a specific frequency resonating within the amplified emotions. Familiar, hauntingly familiar. Zara, teeth gritted, shoved herself to her feet. Years of studying pressure points allowed her to find her mark. She lunged, her fingers jabbing into the faction leader's wrist, disrupting the flow of energy to the weapon. The green light flickered, the mental assault on Brian lessened for a precious few seconds. "Run!" Zara rasped, her voice strained. They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled back through the twisting tunnels. The image of the faction leader's triumphant sneer burned into their minds. Reaching the abandoned research lab, they collapsed against a rusted console, catching their breaths. Bruises bloomed on Zara's face, and Brian's hands still trembled, the echoes of past failures resonating within him. "He wasn't just amplifying emotions," Brian said, his voice hoarse. "He was imprinting them like a neural virus." Zara nodded grimly. "He seeks not merely to control us but to break us, to rewrite our very selves." "Then we need a firewall," Brian muttered, pacing restlessly, "something to block the imprint." Zara's eyes widened. "There is an ancient Talaxian discipline, a meditation technique. It is said to shield the mind from external manipulation. But, Brian pressed, "it is dangerous. The mental and physical tolls are significant. It was forbidden millennia ago." Brian stared at the sonic dampener, his fingers tracing its worn casing. "We don't have millennia, we have this." He began to dismantle the device, his movements precise and driven. "If I can isolate the frequency, the one used to imprint the negative emotions, and then use it to facilitate the meditation." Hours blurred into a frenzied dance of adaptation and experimentation. Brian modified the dampener, rerouting circuits, recalibrating frequencies. Zara guided him, translating ancient texts, explaining the nuances of the meditation technique. They decided to use themselves as test subjects. The first attempt nearly broke them. Brian activated the modified dampener, and Zara began the meditation. A wave of searing pain ripped through their minds, a cacophony of conflicting emotions threatening to overwhelm them. Brian cried out, wrenching the dampener away. "Too much," Zara gasped, clutching her head. "The frequency. It needs refinement." They tried again and again, each time pushing themselves closer to the brink. Sweat plastered their hair to their foreheads, their bodies trembled with exhaustion, but they pressed on, driven by the desperate hope that they could find a way to shield the colony. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The lab plunged into darkness. The hum of the dampener ceased. He cut off the power, Zara said, her voice flat. Brian cursed under his breath. He grabbed a flashlight and scanned the lab. There's a geothermal vent nearby. I remember seeing it on the schematics. We can reroute the power. He worked quickly, improvising connections, splicing wires, his movements fueled by adrenaline. As he completed the circuit, a low growl echoed from the darkness outside. Then another, closer this time. What was that? Zara whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for a discarded pipe. Brian shone the flashlight into the inky blackness. Two pairs of glowing eyes stared back at them. Mutated Talaxian wildlife, drawn to the geothermal activity, now stalked them. They fought back to back, their movements desperate and efficient. Brian used the flashlight to blind the creatures, while Zara wielded the pipe with surprising force. As they battled, she noticed something else. The vegetation around the vent was withered and blackened, the soil cracked and dry. The amplified emotions, she realized, her voice tight with horror, they're not just affecting the Talaxians, they're poisoning the land. Just as they managed to drive off the creatures, a faint signal crackled over Brian's comm. It was the Talaxian medic from the colony, his voice barely audible over the static. Dr. Thomas, Zara, the faction leader. He plans to unleash the amplified emotions on the entire colony. During the gathering, at dawn, the signal died. Brian stared at Zara, his face grim. He doesn't just want to control us, he wants to destroy us, to tear our society apart from the inside out. They knew what they had to do. They had to confront the faction leader, to stop him before he could unleash his weapon on the unsuspecting Talaxians. As they prepared to leave, Zara opened a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, nestled among layers of dust and cobwebs, was a small cache of vials filled with a viscous, luminescent fluid. Herbal remedies, she explained, her voice hushed, potent ones. They can temporarily boost the effectiveness of the emotional shield, but the side effects, they can be lethal. Dawn was breaking as they arrived at the public gathering. The air was thick with tension, the faces of the Talaxians etched with anxiety and suspicion. The faction leader stood on a makeshift stage, the emotion amplifier held high, a malevolent grin spreading across his face. He was ready, the Talaxians were ready, and Brian and Zara had to decide who would be ready to act and how would they do it. Brian swallowed the pungent paste Zara offered, the bitter herbs burning a trail down his throat. He saw Zara mirror him, her violet eyes watering slightly. "It will fortify our minds," she rasped, her voice tight with apprehension. "Prepare us for what is to come." The remedy tasted of earth and resilience, a promise of strength in the face of overwhelming fear. They emerged from the clinic into the violet twilight, the air thick with anticipation. The Talaxian gathering was a sea of agitated faces, their chirps and clicks sharp with fear and anger. At the center, bathed in the flickering light of plasma torches, stood the faction leader, their eyes gleaming with manic fervor as they adjusted the device that would amplify the collective despair. Brian, heart hammering against his ribs, activated the modified sonic dampener. A shimmering, translucent dome sprang into existence, encompassing a section of the crowd nearest to him and Zara. Those within the shield gasped, their expressions shifting from terror to wary relief. Those outside remained exposed, their faces contorted with raw emotion, a stark visual testament to the impending psychic assault. The faction leader raised a hand, and a wave of amplified negativity crashed against Brian's mind. He staggered, visions of his past failures assaulting him, the sterile lab, the failing vitals, the lifeless eyes of his patient. The weight of his past threatened to crush him. Beside him, Zara cried out, clutching her head, her body trembling. He glimpsed her own deepest fears, the loss of her people, the destruction of her culture, the extinction of hope. Zara, drawing upon her ancestral knowledge, jabbed her fingers into specific pressure points on her temples, her movements precise and deliberate. A wave of counter-energy pulsed from her, disrupting the emotional weapon's focus, but the strain was immense. She coughed, a dark fluid flecking her mandibles. The remedy, only, shields. So much, she gasped, her voice weakening. Witnessing Zara's sacrifice, a surge of adrenaline coursed through Brian. He understood now. This wasn't just about technology, it was about understanding the specific frequencies of their fear. He recalibrated the sonic dampener, focusing its energy into a tight beam, targeting the faction leader's emotional signature. The air crackled with energy as the beam locked on, disrupting the faction leader's control. A wave of raw emotion erupted from the faction leader, no longer amplified but exposed. Their twisted motivations, their vision of societal collapse, their engineered disease all broadcast directly into the minds of the Talaxians. The crowd recoiled, their fear turning to outrage. Whispers of disbelief and anger rippled through the gathering. The scales had fallen from their eyes. Seizing the moment, Brian moved into the crowd, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. He knelt beside a child coughing violently, their skin clammy and pale. "Easy now," he murmured, administering the cure. He moved from child to child, his hands steady, his purpose clear. The sonic dampener hummed, a shield against the lingering emotional residue. The faction leader, weakened and exposed, lunged forward, attempting to release a final, devastating wave of the disease. But the Talaxians, their fear replaced by righteous anger, surged forward, overwhelming their former leader. Brian, with a swift kick, disarmed the device. Zara, despite her injuries, added her strength to the effort, her violet eyes blazing with defiance. The threat was neutralized. As the children began to recover, their coughs subsiding, their color returning, a wave of gratitude washed over the Talaxian gathering. They looked at Brian not with suspicion but with awe. He had faced their fears, fought their demons, and saved their children. They acknowledged him, not as an outsider but as an ally, a healer. Brian watched the children, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. He saw in their recovering faces a reflection of his own healing. The memories of his past failure still lingered, but they no longer held the same power. He had learned from his mistakes, grown from his pain. His experience, his empathy had made him a stronger, more effective doctor. Zara, leaning heavily on a nearby structure, smiled weakly at Brian. "You have saved my people, Brian Thomas," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with warmth. "You have shown us the true meaning of compassion. Do not let your past hold you back. Your gifts are needed." Brian met Zara's gaze, a profound sense of connection passing between